America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
The drug war was launched in the 1960s to 1970s by the Nixon administration. The Reagan administration continued to escalate the war and heighten the fear and hysteria surrounding drugs.
From every child's heart and replace it with a nightmare.
The response to this was a consensus that enacting severe punishments for low-level drug crimes would eliminate illegal drug use. As the years went by, it has become apparent that the war on drugs is really a war on people of color that live in poverty. The war on drugs incarcerates and criminalizes minorities at alarming rates through petty drug laws that create racial disparity and restrict them from achieving a higher education.
According to FAM.org, mandatory minimum sentencing laws set a minimum amount of time that a judge must sentence someone for certain crimes, including drug crimes. During the 1980s to 1990s, the popular opinion on drugs was that it must be eradicated. The overwhelming media coverage of drug use made it seem like illegal drug use was at an all-time high. Jennifer Robinson explains how crack cocaine was regarded when it first emerged from the shadows. Crack cocaine was the menace that lurked and haunted on the youth of America. When crack cocaine first appeared, it was connected to the inner city, the projects, and gangs. Thus, the connection was made to the people who lived in those areas. According to Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow, drug use was actually down during this time, but the racist hype that surrounded drug use, specifically crack cocaine, escalated the paranoia that was felt. By early 1994, 31 states and DC had mandatory minimums. Mandatory minimums hand the power over to prosecutors. According to the New York Times, because federal laws are very similar and are written in broad language, and because of this, prosecutors have the power to choose from whichever charge could fit the crime. Often, prosecutors try to threaten defendants before they go to trial with charges that carry much longer sentences than the charges that would be brought upon the defendant if they were to go to trial. After the prosecutor makes the decision of what to charge the defendant, mandatory minimum laws force the judge to follow the decision.
Since judges have little to no discretion to sentence an individual based on personal context and background information, more people are going to prison for longer periods of time for petty drug crimes. Imprisonment has become so prevalent in the lives of African American males that it has become a life stage that replaces higher education. Becky Petit, in her article Mass Imprisonment in the Life Course, Race and Class Inequality in U.S. Incarceration, argues that blacks on average are about 8 times more likely to be in state or federal prison than whites. By the end of the 1990s, 21% of young black, poorly educated men were in state or federal prison compared to an imprisonment rate of 2.9% for young white male dropouts. The correlation between the lack of higher education and the probability of incarceration shows the skewed priorities that the United States have employed in regards to their minority population. Imprisoning large groups of people doesn't only hold a moral price, but a substantial financial one for the country as well. According to the article The War on Marijuana in Black and White published by the American Civil Liberties Union, the United States spends $3.6 billion a year to continue the war on drugs. If the resources dedicated to imprisoning minority youth was allocated to educational programs, the choices and futures would be much brighter for those currently being imprisoned. Imprisonment has large effects on African American youths long after they are released. Now with a felony on their record, employment opportunities are vastly limited because of policies that mandate ex-convicts to check the box. In the book, The City That Became Safe, New York's Lesson for Urban Crime and Control, by Franklin E. Zimring, he provides sufficient evidence that African Americans are disproportionately arrested for crimes. Marijuana use is slightly higher among whites than among African American youth, and significantly higher for whites than for Latinos. But African Americans, who comprise 28% of the city's population, absorb 52% of the city's misdemeanor marijuana arrests. The disparity between drug arrests goes further than citywide population. Mandatory minimums and harsh drug laws have a tremendous impact on the United States as a whole.
Changes in laws and policies toward drugs didn't only affect the legal structure of the U.S., but also the general population. However, imprisonment and arrest rates show great racial disparity. Racial disparity between blacks and whites in the drug war is very prevalent in the United States. In the United States, blacks use less marijuana than whites, but are arrested at a much higher rate. DrugPolicy.org attributes the higher rate of arrest of minorities to the law enforcement focus on urban areas, low-income communities, and on communities of color, as well as inequitable treatment by the criminal justice system. DrugPolicy.org also equates the drug war to the Jim Crow laws of the 1960s. San Francisco is a prime example of racial disparity from drug charges. Mona Lynch, who studied the racialized geography of drug law enforcement in San Francisco, states that because of San Francisco's dwindling black community, it can be assumed that the city would not be mentioned as one of the top cities in racially disparate drug law enforcement. That's not the case. In fact, blacks in San Francisco are 28 times more likely than whites to be put in prison when convicted of drug felonies. To make it more personal, in Dylan Matthews' article, The Black-White Marijuana Arrest Rate, he used a graph to show the racial disparity in New York. 3 counties, New York, Kings County, which is Brooklyn, and Suffolk County, are all in close proximity to each other and are a part of the huge racial disparity blacks are seeing when it comes to marijuana arrests. According to the Human Rights Watch, stated in Eric Kane's article from Forbes, black men are sent to federal prison on charges at a rate 57 times greater than white men. Although they only represent 12% of the U.S. population, African Americans account for 62% of drug offenders sent to state prisons.